Exposure is going to be the #1 first technical topic that we talk about on this disc. Because if you don't have a good exposure, you don't have anything else. Even if you have good lighting techniques, if it's underexposed, your image is going to look awful. So let's talk about exposure. What it is, how to know when you've got a good exposure, how to get good exposure, how to monitor that, and how it serves your image, the difference between having a good exposure and having lousy exposure, so you know what you're looking for and how to get it. Now, in some ways, we can draw a parallel between exposure and what we talked about on our Sound for Film and Television DVD, where we explained that, the main goal you're trying to go with there is to record a clean, clear recording of your actor's voice and nothing else. You don't want background noise, you don't want airplanes or dogs barking, you just want your actor's voice, right? Well, exposure, we want a good, clean, clear image and nothing else. We don't want noise and mud and grain and underexposure sucking all the color out of the image. And we also don't want the problems that overexposure can cause, like blown out windows or blown out highlights or flaring in the image. You gotta know that you're in that right realm, that you're getting the image that you want people to see, and you're not polluting it with anything else. And a great thing about exposure is this is an element of lighting that can actually be objectively measured. You can know whether you're doing it right or not, because you can look at various tools, whether it's a waveform monitor or a zebras or a light meter or something, and tell that you're getting enough light, and tell what the ratio is between the lit up side of the face and the shadow side of the face. You can know these things mathematically, you can be right with them. That may not mean that it's lit right for the subjective purpose of the scene, okay? There's subjective interpretations of whether the scene is lit well, but if we ask that question, is the scene lit well? Well, we can objectively measure and say, yes, we have enough brightness, we have enough contrast ratio, it is lit well. But if it's lit appropriately for the mood you're trying to convey, that's a subjective measurement, and we have to talk about that separately. What I'm talking about here is when you light a scene and when you're getting that exposure, you can tell, right or wrong, whether you've got enough light in there and whether you're getting a good, clean signal or not. And you need to know what those measuring tools are, how they work, and then use them to get good, robust images to make sure that the images that you come home with and work with in post are going to be solid, workable, good quality. How do you know when you have enough light for a proper exposure? Let me tell you, the very worst way in the world to judge that is by looking at the little LCD, the flip-out screen on your camcorder. That's a terrible way to gauge what kind of exposure you're getting, because you have no idea how accurate that LCD may be or may not be. If you rotate that LCD just a little bit, it can dramatically change what the picture looks like. So how do you know that you're getting a proper exposure? There's lots of tools available to you, and let's look at a few of them. First one we're going to start with, this is a light meter. This measures the amount of light that's falling on a subject and will tell you what iris to put your camera at. So you dial in what the speed of your film is, or if you're using it for a video camera, the sensitivity of your video camera. You then dial in what your frame rate is or your exact shutter speed. This measures the amount of light that's falling onto this disc. So we put the meter here and the light is hitting it, and we click the button and it tells us, okay, we need f2.0 and a half, 2.0 to a 2.8 split, basically. And then on the film camera, I would set the iris and we'd shoot, and we'd know that we're going to get enough exposure. If you're shooting film, this is kind of pretty much what you have to have. For video, this is the wrong tool for the job. I don't want anybody thinking that, well, if you don't have a light meter, you're not a real cinematographer. Man, look at the light meter on that guy. Yeah, no, that's ridiculous. A light meter can come in handy for scouting locations, for you to get, spot readings of when the sun is at 4 o'clock, we're reading so many foot candles off of that. Great. Then you, as a gaffer, you could know how much lighting equipment you're going to have to bring in to counteract that. Sure, there is a place for it in every shoot. A light meter for setting exposure on video is the wrong tool for the job, because a video camera does so much processing and image manipulation inside it that the meter doesn't know about that and doesn't know how to compensate for that. Light meter can be useful for some aspects, but I'll tell you what, on most professional video shoots, I don't see these things around because there's much, much, much better tools available for analyzing a video signal. With film, we don't have that. We don't have that option. So we have to measure the available light. So when working with film, you have to test the meter and test your film stock and learn how the film stock responds, so that you go through and run a whole bunch of tests with your meter and you know exactly what stop you set it at. Then you go and process that film and you get it back and you know the film stock and how it responds. With a video camera, we don't have to go through all that because we can actually see. Based on the other tools that we're going to talk about, you can actually see what the camera is doing to the image and you know exactly what you're getting. So with a video camera, light meter is not really the tool you're going to be using to judge exposure with. So what do you use? Well, just about every professional camera and a lot of cameras below that have what we call zebras. And the zebras are a great tool to use to know when something is above a certain level of brightness. But before we get into that, let's talk about how brightness is measured. We have to go to the Institute of Radio Engineers, IRE, and they have a scale which ranges from 0 to 110, and 0 is pure black, and 110 is pure white. Anything brighter than the brightest thing a camcorder can resolve is going to measure at 110, and anything above that is we call clipping. A middle gray might show up at the middle of the scale. Maybe that'd be 50 or 55 IRE. The brightness level is the IRE level. And, down towards the bottom, when we start getting into the blacks, maybe 10 or 5 or 2 IRE, those are going to be really, really dark. And anything darker than that will clip off the bottom or be crushed off the bottom, and we call that clip down at 0 or crushed blacks. So we're dealing with a scale of 0 to 110. And in that scale, what the zebras do is they let you know when any element of your image has exceeded a certain IRE level. So the way we typically use this is, let's say we have 2 zebra levels in the camera. A lot of cameras have 2 zebra settings. So we might use one to gauge what the skin tones are. And for a Caucasian face, typically you want the skin tones to be maybe 60 to 70 IRE for a good, adequate, healthy, robust exposure. And at 70, you're looking at pretty much the brightest elements of the face. So, maybe the bridge of the nose, maybe the forehead, wherever that specular highlight is, where the light is most reflective, where it's brightest on the skin, you want that to be in the ballpark of maybe 70, with the overall face maybe around 60, depending, of course, on your contrast ratio. Obviously, the shadow side might be darker and the key side might be brighter, but in that general ballpark. So we use zebras to judge that. We might set our zebras at 70, and then anything that shows up in that image that's 70 IRE or hotter or brighter than 70 is going to have the zebra pattern displayed over it. You can see from the example here, it kind of looks like zebra stripes, and they're usually crawling over the image. You can see exactly where they are. And this will show up in the camcorder viewfinder, or maybe there are certain monitors that you can get that would actually have a zebra display, or something like Adobe On Location software will actually show zebras. So zebras are going to be a pretty constant element you're going to find in the world of video production. And at 70 IRE, setting those zebras, that might tell us where a good skin tone is. So maybe what I want to do is set my zebras at 70 and then adjust my exposure so that I'm seeing zebras only on the very hottest patches of the face or on the skin at some point. Just practically no zebras anywhere except on those very hottest spots. And that'll let me know that my overall exposure is probably in a pretty good range and that particular bit is just clipping at 70. But I don't really know where that IRE is because the zebra only tells me it's at this level or above. So it's possible that that level could be, 100 or 90 or something way hotter. So that's why we ride the iris up and down until we just open it enough that those zebras just start to appear. And then I know that I've got the skin tones at a pretty decent exposure level there. So then I can go over to my second level of zebras. And here I want to check for clipping to make sure that nothing is too bright or blown out in the image. You want to make sure that you're not getting anything over 100 or 105 IRE anywhere in your picture unless it's something that you really don't care about. Now remember, the scale goes to 110, and pretty much anything above 105 is going to be indistinguishable all white. So 105, or maybe if you want to be more conservative, set it down to 100 and just monitor to make sure that nothing in your image is exceeding 100 IRE. Now, the reason you want to do this is because as the image gets brighter and brighter, of course, that IRE value is going up, there's going to be a limit to where your camera just can't resolve anymore. And we'll talk more about this in the dynamic range section. But simply put, if something's too bright, it's going to burn out. It's going to blow out to pure white with no detail whatsoever. So let's say we're shooting a sky and we have some trees and we let the sky blow out. It's going to look terrible. It's going to look like a pure white scene, whereas that might have been, to our eyes, might have been a nice pale blue with maybe some white puffy clouds in there. It's still going to be a very bright image, and if we let that blow out, if we set our zebras and we see that after 105 IRE that the sky is still showing zebras, then you're in danger that that's going to blow out. And it looks really ugly, and that's usually a pretty telltale sign that something was shot on video instead of film. Film has very smooth roll-off in the highlights, and it holds on to detail in the highlights longer. Video doesn't. Video, when it clips hard, and it clips ugly, and it's nasty looking, and you want to avoid clipping at all costs. So that's why if you want to eke the absolute maximum out of your camcorder's range, maybe you'll set them at 105, but if you want to be a little more conservative, set them at 100 and try not to see any zebras at 100. You know, if you're shooting outdoors and you set your skin tones at 70 and then you pop over and you set the zebras at 100 now to look at where the sky is or maybe where white cars are or anything that's bright out there, if you're seeing zebras over 100, that's probably in danger of clipping. So you can set your zebras wherever you want. I know professional cinematographers who like to run them at 80 and 90 because they like to really control that highlight range. Typically, I like to know where I'm at in immediate circumstance. So I like to know that the skin tone, again, for conventional Caucasian skin, it might be at 70. For other tones of skin, it might be a little bit lower. But I like to know, so I set it 70 to know that I've got that skin tone where I want it, and then I'll pop over to 105 because I roll that way. I like to know that I'm getting the maximum range. I want to make sure that nothing shows up on my screen whatsoever at 105 or above. And that way I know that I'm within pretty much a safe range of the camcorder. Again, until you really know for sure exactly what look you like, I might recommend that you stick with 100 instead of 105, just to give you that little extra bit of room. And you pretty much don't want to see anything showing up unless you know, as a artistic statement, you want that item to burn to pure white. Or maybe it's something that it's okay that it burns out to pure white, like a light bulb. You know, if you have a bare light bulb, you're doing your interrogation scene, there's a bare light bulb swinging up in the sky, maybe that is okay being over at 100 or 105. But if it's a newspaper or a white shirt or anything like that, if you set that zebra at 105 or even 100, you really don't want to see those zebras showing up at all on those items, and that way you'll know that you're capturing the actual detail that's there. Now, some cameras have another exposure tool, which is what we call the marker, or maybe it's called Y-Git on your particular camera. And what this is basically a spot meter. It tells you the brightness level of what's in the center of the screen. And this is fantastic for just quick spot metering. And basically that's what it is. It's, as we have in a light meter, we have a spot meter. That's kind of what the marker is. It tells us what is in that particular spot, what the brightness is at that point. Or like I say on the professional line camcorders, maybe it's called Y-Git, and Y is based on the component breakdown of video is YUV, and Y stands for luminance. So it's a luminance git. It's telling me, you know, what is the luminance value at that very center portion of the screen. And that's pretty handy because then you can spot reference what the brightness is on any particular portion. And let's say you're doing something like lighting a green screen and you need the green screen to be evenly lit. Well, it's awful nice to be able to zoom into that one little section there and pan the camera across that green screen, and you'll see if it changes. You know, if you got the green screen lit at 50 IRE or 55 IRE, and then you put on that marker and you pan that all across the green screen and it stays about 50 or 55 or whatever you're at, you're probably okay. But if you pan across a section, it's like, you know, 62, well, now you know there's a hot spot there. And that marker will tell you exactly where that hot spot is, so you can go in and fix that. So the zebras tell you at a glance what portions of the screen might be at a certain brightness level or above, but you don't really know what that brightness level is. When you're using this marker function or the Y-Git function, it will tell you exactly what the brightness level is of that particular section of the screen. Now what I want to talk about is the waveform monitor. And the waveform monitor is the stuff. This is what you want to be using. The other tools, yeah, nice to have, but the waveform monitor does everything they do and 100 times more. So it's an intimidating looking thing if you haven't worked with one before, but it doesn't take long to see exactly what it's doing for you. Now, there's levels and levels you can go into a professional waveform monitor. We're only going to go across the surface of it and talk about basically how you use it to judge exposure, to know what you're getting. A lot of people may be familiar with a histogram. A waveform monitor is pretty much nothing like a histogram. A histogram is a snapshot of how brightness is distributed over an entire image. If the histogram is all bunched up over on the right side, maybe you got an image that's too bright. And if it's bunched up over on the left side, it's too dark, right? But that's like referencing your entire image all at one little clump. A waveform monitor doesn't do that at all, because a waveform monitor tells you at a glance, first of all, on the left to right, it's actually a representation of what your image is. So as you see somebody walk through the image, you'll see it happen on the waveform monitor. You'll be able to follow what that object is because you can see it play out. It looks like a display from the Matrix or something like that, but pretty soon you get to learn how to read that. The next thing you're going to notice is that it's a 2-axis scale. So you got the horizontal is actually referencing the horizontal elements in your image, and the vertical is representing the brightness of the image. And so we have that 0 to 110 scale laid out here. So we can see exactly how bright the elements of our image are. So I can look at a nice, robust waveform image, and I can see that nothing is clipping off the top, nothing is crushing off the bottom. I probably have a pretty reasonably well-exposed image here. Now look what happens if we totally underexpose an image. You see all this brightness comes down, and now everything's really bunched down here, down at the bottom. You don't want to be there. That's kind of nasty because, like we said before, video cameras, usually if there's going to be noise, it's going to be in the darker elements of the image. So if you bunch everything down low, dark, then you're probably going to be getting a pretty nasty, noisy image. And you don't have the ability to expand that back up in post cleanly because all the detail is being recorded in this little tiny clumped up bunch. So this is not where you want to be. And if you're overexposed, you'll know because you'll see it starts to clip right off the top there. Instead of having this nice smooth waveform that we could have, as it gets brighter and brighter and brighter, it flattens out because it's being clipped off that plateau. It really is like somebody's just slicing the image off because you're getting no detail from that point or higher. It's all about getting enough quality information into the footage so that when you go into post, you've got something you can work with. So you don't want to let anything clip that you don't have to. You don't want to have it crushed. You want to have a good, nice distribution throughout the graph here, because the more of that image that you're using, the more the dynamic range of the camera you're using, the more detail you're going to be able to capture. Now, what else can we see in here? Okay, it looks like we might have a little bit of a trouble spot here. Look at this spot. This is clipping. So what is that? I look spatially. That's, it's so far over in the frame. So let's look on our monitor. That's some white object in the screen. Okay, let's get rid of that. Let's pull that out of there. Now, you look on the waveform, and you can see that that's pretty hot and pretty clipping. We pull that out of there, and whoop, now our waveform drops into a nice, happy range. If I needed that white object in there, I might have to adjust the light on it to bring it down to make sure that it's not clipping. So you can see how the waveform monitor gives us a direct representation spatially left to right, but not really vertically. It's not a direct copy of a monitor because on the vertical axis, it's giving us relative brightness. But on the horizontal axis, it is matching up with what our monitor is showing us. What we're seeing here, when you look at a vertical column on the waveform monitor, there may be lots and lots and lots of dots. And that's letting you know that there's certain amounts of image information that are at various brightness levels in that column. So if we had a gradient and it was perfectly from black at the bottom to white up at the top, then on the waveform monitor, I might see an even distribution of information because there's some black and there's some gray and there's some light gray and there's some white, and it'll be evenly spread out. If I had something that was dark gray and a light gray, I might actually see 2 lines on the waveform monitor because it's letting me know that there's a whole bunch of stuff that's dark gray and a whole bunch of stuff that's light gray. So the more information there is, or the more image detail there is at any certain brightness level, then the brighter the pixels will be on the waveform monitor at that level. So if I had a very evenly distributed image in that vertical column, because we're talking about only as the image goes left to right, we're dealing with each column of the image, then I would have an even distribution of pixels, and they would all be of relatively even brightness. But if I had just one item in there, let's say I had a pure blue sky, then I might only have a thin line on the waveform monitor at that point, because everything is exactly the same brightness, so it will bunch it all together. And this can be very handy. Now, if you want to talk about light in a green screen, I talked about in the marker section, with the Y-git, having to pan all over the green screen. But look what happens when we light a green screen with the waveform monitor. What we want to achieve here is we want to get the thinnest, tightest band going across the screen because we want that green to be even and flatly lit. So if we can get this to be where it is the tightest, thinnest band, then we know that we're getting exactly the same brightness level because all the brightnesses are being rendered at exactly that same IRE level. And that is when you have a great green screen. That's when it's fantastic. If you have a kind of a lousy green screen, if you have various brightness levels, so that, there's dark spots and there's bright spots and stuff, then what you'll see is the band on the waveform monitor will be thicker because it's showing you that there's darker sections and medium sections and lighter sections all throughout there. And you don't want that. You want the tightest, evenly lit, cleanest screen that you can get. So you want to adjust your lights to make sure that you're getting a nice, flat, even field. So a waveform monitor is fantastic for something like that. It's fantastic for being able to look at a glance and know whether you have any exposure problems, whether something is clipping or whether it's crushing off the bottom, whether you're overall overexposing or underexposing. For reflected light, it's pretty easy to use a grayscale chart. Just slap a gray chart up there and look at the reference on the waveform monitor. You'll have an X pattern in there. And as long as the left and right edges aren't clipping off the top or off the bottom, then you're okay. You're within the camera's range. You want to maximize that range. You want black to be near the bottom and you want the white to be near the top. Just don't clip and don't crush it off of there, and you're going to have a pretty decent image. So let's take an example. We're gonna shoot a scene here, and we'll use the zebras to set our exposure, right? So we set our zebras at 70, and we look at the subject here, and we're just really dialing it in to where the zebras are just barely showing, okay? And then we look at the clipping zebras, and let's go to the 105. Let's be bold. Let's go to the 105, right? And we can see that maybe a little reflection here is showing up. I'm not really worried about that. That's okay. That can go there, but nothing else is showing up. That's an okay exposure, right? Well, now let's look at what the waveform monitor shows us and show you how it is, like I say, it's zebras on steroids. It tells you everything. Let's look at the subject, and we can see that spatially, we can see the subject reflected on the waveform monitor or represented on the waveform monitor. So we know that this is the person's face. If they wave, we can see that that's their hand waving, so we know what we're dealing with. So as we look at the shape of the face, we know where in the brightness range that's hitting. So if it's not bright enough, I can open up the iris, and you see how the waveform monitor grows taller because now it's moving where that brightness is. Because remember, the waveform monitor is not giving us an absolute reading of what the light level is. It's telling us how the camera is seeing the brightness be represented. So as I add light, the camera will see more brightness. As I stop down the iris, the camera will see less brightness. So you can control that. If I change the shutter speed, it will also change the amount of brightness that the camera is receiving, and the waveform monitor will reflect that. So we can use the iris here to dial in and get to where the person's face is between 60 and 70. That's a nice, good looking shot. That's kind of where we want them to be. And now we can spot check and see, oh, the background, if the background is too dark, maybe I need to add light to it. Or maybe I need to open up the iris and take a little bit of light away from my subject. Let's try that. Let's open up the iris here, and now the background is coming up, but my subject's too bright. So now I'm going to back the light off. And as I pull that light away, now we're seeing that the background is staying at its same basic level because we're not lighting that background. We're only lighting our subject. So the background's staying at its same basic level, but as I pull the light away, the light brightness, the intensity is dropping off, and so now the face is coming back down to where we wanted it to be. So now I've been able to control the relative brightness of the subject and the background and know exactly what I'm getting by working with the waveform monitor. Now, a waveform monitor as a standalone device can be pretty darn expensive, and that's why on no-budget shoots you don't see them very often. But there are alternatives. There are some camcorders out on the market that actually have waveform monitors built into them, which is fantastic. You press a button, it pops up on your screen, and you know exactly what you've got, and it costs you nothing. A second way to get a hold of a waveform monitor is a lot of modern LCD production monitors have waveform monitors built right into them. So yeah, press a button, waveform monitor pops up, and you can judge your exposure there. Another way to go is if you're using external software, maybe something like Adobe's On Location. That has a fantastic waveform monitor in it. You can also use a lot of different tools like maybe Scopebox or HD Monitor Pro. Sometimes you can even use your nonlinear editing software and get a live waveform reading out of that. So if you have a laptop computer that you could bring with you and plug in through FireWire, or maybe you have a HDMI or some other way to connect the video signal, you might be able to get a live waveform monitor off your computer. However you get it, if you want to get the best range, make sure that you have the best exposure. You really want to get a hold of a waveform monitor one way or the other and learn how to use it, and you will save yourself a tremendous amount of post-processing. Next big section we want to go into is talking about the dynamic range of the camera. You can only see a certain amount of brightness on the camera before there's just too much. And it's like if you step outside, if you've been in a dark room and you step outside, you can't see anything, right? I mean, your eyes are burning out. You got to slap some sunglasses on there or you can't see anything. Well, the camera is the same way, only a lot more. Your eyes can see a much wider range of the spectrum from dark to bright than the camera can see. The camera has a pretty limited window. So if we're looking at the overall world of brightness here, and we have pure suns up here and absolute pitch black in a cave at night on the dark side of the moon is down here. Okay, so this is pure black and this is pure white. How much can your camera actually see? Not really all that much. You have a limited latitude or limited dynamic range, so it might only be able to see this much. And that's the amount of difference between bright and dark that it can handle. Now, all this still exists, but the camera doesn't see it. All this still exists, but the camera doesn't see it. Anything from the top of your camera's range on up is just rendered as pure white. It's clipped off the top. And anything from the bottom of your camera's dynamic range on down is rendered as pure black. Now, there could be all sorts of shadow detail in here, but the camera simply doesn't have the ability to resolve it. So how big is this window? If I'm using a professional broadcast camera, maybe I might have around 8 or 9 or 10. If I'm using a cheapo video camera, I might have a really small window. I might have 4 stops. If you're shooting film, maybe as much as 13 stops. You might be able to see a big window like this, whereas with a video camera, you might only be able to see this. And this is a huge, important thing to understand. It's easier to light for film than it is for video. Video is harder because we have to fit everything we want to see into this smaller window. Whereas with film, we got so much more room. You know, it can see 13 stops. We can have highlights and we can have shadows up to here. We still can't see the whole spectrum of everything. Nothing can resolve that, but we can see a good range here. And with video, maybe only a small range. Now, when you're looking at a waveform monitor, you'll see that this little window that I'm talking about, that is exactly represented by a waveform monitor. Anything that gets brighter up above that 110, that's clipped to white. That's no good. And so we can see that waveform monitor is showing us on the 0 to 110 scale, that's the amount of latitude that this camera is able to deliver. That's the amount of the darkest dark to the brightest bright. As we change the iris that we're exposing, you know, as I open up the iris, I can see deeper into the shadows. And as I close down the iris, I can hold on to more highlights. So I can move that window within the realm of overall brightness. But I can't expand the size of the window. That's based on the camera. So you have this limited window, and you have to make sure that everything that you want to see fits within that window. So this is where lighting comes into play. We have to make sure that if something is too bright, let's say that I look at my scene as I start out, this is my window, but this is the actual brightness of my scene. I have windows in the shot, and they're so bright that they're off the top here, and I have deep shadow down here, and that's just too dark, and I can't see that. What do I have to do? I have to actually modify the lighting of the scene to bring those elements into where I need it. So I have to cut the brightness on anything that's too bright, and if something's off the bottom, if it's too dark, Nothing to do for that, but shine some light in there. Bring the light in there and you'll bring it up within the dynamic range that your camera can handle. And now it all starts to tie back together when we talked about a certain number of stops of dynamic range. If I have a situation where this element is falling off the bottom and it's one stop too dark to fit on our range, now I know if I move that light 1.4 times closer, now it will bring that object up one stop and put it back within my 6 or 8 or 9 stops of dynamic range that I had. And if I change the iris on the camera, that moves where this window occurs. All these things work together in concert to control or help us to control and try to make sure that we're fitting every element that we want to see into the available dynamic range. I mean, this is great because you have a lot of choices. There are a lot of ways that you can get at this. Director of photography calls you and says, hey, cut that light source in half. Cut that down by one stop. So what are you going to do? There's a lot of ways you can get there, but the net result is going to be pretty much the same. So let's take, for example, a fluorescent fixture. It's a 4-bank fluorescent. You could turn 2 of the tubes off, and you've cut the amount of light in half because it's generating half as much light. That's one way. Or whatever type of light source it is, let's say it's a tungsten light and it's got a 500-watt lamp in there. You could pull that lamp out and put a 250 in there. That will cut the light in half. That's a way you could go. Neither of those are necessarily the most practical, but it is a way you could go. Here's another way you could go. You could put a one-stop neutral density gel in front of the light. Now, neutral density gel will absorb half the light that hits it, and it will let the other half come through. So that's a real quick and easy way. If you have a sheet of neutral density gel, you lay it over there, and yeah, you've cut the amount of light in half, just like you would have the other ways. Okay, here's another way that you can cut light in half. You could use a scrim. Maybe you're dealing with a hot light, like a tungsten par, and it comes with a scrim set. Find a one-stop scrim, put that in there, and a scrim is a fine net, and where the wires are will absorb the light, and the holes will let the light through. So you can cut the amount of light in half that way. Or let's say you had a situation where you don't have any of that stuff on hand. Maybe you have a net. Maybe you've got a kit that has flags and nets. Maybe you have a one-stop net in there. Throw that up there. It'll work just like the scrim. You got to get a little bit of distance from the light because you don't want the net to burn, but you put it on a stand, put it in front of the light, and you've just cut the amount of light in half. Let's say you're a no-budget guy, and you don't have any of that stuff. You got your one little light source, and you want to cut in half. Quickest and easiest way, just grab that light and move it 40% further. If it's 3 feet away, move it to 4.2 feet. It's not a whole lot of distance, but it will cut the light in half, and the net effect is the same. You've cut the light in half every one of those ways, with the possible complication that you may have increased the spread if you move the light further away, but if you're dealing with something with barn doors, big deal. Tap the barn doors in. But the point is, there are so many ways that you can control the intensity and brightness of that light. You can move it closer, you can move it further, you can gel it, you can scrim it, you can net it, you can cut some tubes, you can change the lamp. There's a million ways to get there. And that's what we want you to understand even when you're looking at light sources. There's a million different types of light sources. As long as you know what you're trying to accomplish, you can make that light behave the way you want with these light controls or with just moving it. As long as you understand that a stop of light is a stop of light, how you get there isn't necessarily the most important thing, and there's a lot of ways to get there.
Computer screens under tungsten lighting or just regular room lighting. I'm sure you've seen this before. The light that a computer screen gives off is really, really, really blue. So it's pretty hard to not have your computer screen or your TV screen or your LCD screen or whatever it might be not look really blue if you're using tungsten lighting and shooting indoors. So what do you do about it? Well, there are ways of changing color temperature. For example, you can actually go into your operating system or go into the adjustment controls of the monitor itself and change the colors so that they are less blue. Or you can get one of these guys. A color to orange gel. And you may see that it brings the color temperature so that it's not quite as blue and the colors look a little bit more appropriate to what they should be. And you'll notice it kind of cuts the brightness of the monitor so that it doesn't look quite as bright or quite as slightly blown out as it might have before I put this up. And of course you can get the CTO gels at various strengths. You can get it so that it blocks more light or less light. And if you get something that's even actually a little darker than this, then it's going to cut more light and the screen will actually look less bright and more in keeping with the actual lighting in the room. But it's also very shiny, and if I move it back and forth, you can probably see highlight reflections of the light from the room and the lights that are shining on me being reflected in there. And plus, kind of wrinkly, and you're likely to see that kind of wrinkling if you put it up against the screen, and you can just see all sorts of stuff. So, not the best solution there, although it is a workable one, and it's something that we've used in the past. Probably the best solution is to change the light in the room so that it actually matches the computer screen. And you do this using light of color temperature of blue, of 5600K. You can do this with many modern fluorescent fixtures. You can certainly do it with HMIs. You can even actually let some sunlight in and let the sunlight light the room, and that's going to be some nice bright blue light, which is going to pretty much match the computer monitors.